Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. So today I'm going to share with you a review of the new Morphe times James Charles Unleash Your Inner Artist palette. I'm also going to be comparing it to the Morphe times Jaclyn Hill palette. I'm wearing each of these on each eye today, so I'll show you how I did each eye look with each palette, show you guys how the pigmentation is, blendability, shade comparisons between both palettes, and just the formula in general, and my thoughts between the differences in each palette. So if you guys want to know all my thoughts about this palette and how it compares to the Jaclyn Hill Morphe palette, then just keep on watching. Alright, so here is the Morphe by James Charles Unleash Your Inner Artist palette. This is a $39 palette with 39 shadows. It was modeled after the Morphe 39A from last year, the Dare to Create palette, which is very, very similar, but that one's a little bit more neutral. And then in this palette, you have 13 shimmer shades and 26 matte shades. Some of those shadows are also pressed pigments, like this one. You have this purple shade. Some of these up here are also pressed pigments, so they're just really, really pigmented shadows that are going to blend a little bit differently. And then in this palette, you also get 2.67 ounces of eyeshadow, in case you're curious. Basically, that just means you have a ton of eyeshadow in this palette for $39, 39 shades for $39. And then this palette retails for $38 and you have 35 shadows in here. You get 1.98 ounces of product total, so you do get a bit more in the James Charles palette, and then you get 17 shimmers and 18 matte shades. That's basically the breakdown between both palettes with the price point, the size, how many of the different textures you get. Here is how different they are in size. They're both really big palettes. You got a lot of eyeshadow in both. I've had this one for a year and a half and I haven't hit pan in any of them, and I wear this palette a ton. So that's kind of the differences between both. I want to go ahead into the swatches for this palette. I did film the swatches separately because there's so many shadows and I didn't want to make this like an hour-long video. So I will give you guys a quick breakdown of each row within this palette. So starting off with the first row, we have a mix of mattes and shimmer shades. The mattes in here, some of these are pressed pigment, so they are going to apply really, really pigmented, and they're going to be slightly more difficult to blend out. Next up in the second row, you're going to have all of your red and purple and pink tones, still in the neutral family for sure. You do have this like bright red and then a burgundy color, and then you have your one brown shade. So this is really like your true brown blending shade. Once we get into the middle row, these are way deeper, and this one applies like super orange, this big orange shade in the center of the palette. So this one on the end is really going to be like your one staple brown transition shade. It is more of like a light cool tone shade. On me, it barely shows up. I really, really need to like build up this shade, and then this is going to be like your more maroon blending shade. But just take note that there is just like one true brown, light brown blending color in this palette. And then moving into the third row, you have 7 shades. 6 are mattes, 1 is a shimmer that I really like for a highlighter shade, to highlight your brow bone, for a lid color, just like a staple shade for every day. Really, really like that shadow. You have a stark white, and then a lot of these you would use for like blending as well. A lot of these are deeper, and like this orange shade, it looks kind of brown in the pan, but when I apply this on my eye, it really looks like very burnt orange. So it's not gonna apply like super neutral if that's what you guys are used to, like more of that like neutral brown colors. And then the last 2 rows are all the rainbow shades. Here you have a lot of your greens and purples, some shimmer shades. This one is a pressed pigment, a dark purple shade. All of these apply really nicely as well. I love the green and the blue in this palette. They're both super pretty, really pigmented, really easy to blend out. This blue is what I'm wearing on one of my eyes today. And then lastly, we have our second row of like the rainbow shades. Blues, purples, and pinks, all of them are really pigmented as well. This purple is difficult. I've used it on a couple different eye looks, and I use it differently each time. I keep trying it with different shades in here, and I find if you layer it with some of these other purples, it's gonna apply a lot better compared to just like starting off an eye look with this purple. It's what I'm wearing on this eye, on the outer corner. So that one's a little bit more tricky. The blues apply really nicely in here, and then this pressed pigment's a little bit tricky as well, but you can definitely build it up and get a really pigmented look. So those are all the shades just in the James Charles palette. Comparing them to the Jaclyn Hill Morphe palette, like if you look at both palettes, they're definitely not the same palette. The Jaclyn Hill palette is gonna be way more neutrals. Mine's way more dirty because I've had it for years. There is way more neutrals in the Jaclyn Hill palette, but looking at the colorful shades, there are some similarities within the colorful shades, but they're definitely not identical. You can get really similar looks, but none of the colorful shades, none of like the purples, blues, or greens are identical in each palette. I'm gonna go ahead and show you guys some comparisons of the neutral shades in both palettes because a lot of them are really identical in both palettes. So I'm just gonna go ahead and swatch those and I'll show you guys all of those neutral comparisons. All right, so here are some swatches of 11 shadows that are really, really similar, if not identical, between both palettes. On this side, we have the Jaclyn Hill Morphe palette, and then on this side, we have the James Charles Morphe palette. Just this one like pink shade's a little bit different, but everything else is like super, super identical. Of course, there's a lot of shades that you're gonna find pretty much identical in any palette you have, like a matte black or a dark brown. But some of these shadows are so similar to each other, if not identical, that you probably don't need both palettes, especially if you tend to gravitate towards neutral colors and you maybe just wear like a pop of color every now and then. If you think you're gonna get either palette and basically just stick to the neutrals, they're really, really similar in both palettes. And in the James Charles palette, these are like the majority of the neutral shades. These are like the neutral shimmer shades and a lot of the neutral, just the neutral shades in general. Most of the other shades that you're gonna get in his palette are gonna be more bright reds, oranges, and then all of the rainbow shades in the bottom 2 rows. So if you're somebody who really just sticks to neutrals and you already have the Jaclyn Hill Morphe palette, you basically have all of those neutral shades that are also in the James Charles Morphe palette. Like these look pretty identical. Almost all of them look pretty identical. So definitely keep that in mind. But also to give you guys even more of a comparison between both palettes, I do have the Jaclyn Hill palette on one eye and then the James Charles palette on the other eye. I'm gonna go ahead into the tutorial so you guys can see how I got this eye look with each palette. All right, so I'm gonna use the Jaclyn Hill palette on one side and the James Charles palette on the other side and see if I can get the same look. We could see how each side blends out with the different mattes and shimmers. I'm gonna do Jaclyn on this side and then James Charles palette on this side. And I want to show you guys like all of the different bases that I've used with the James Charles palette and just like my experience so far. Since he did recommend to use a specific eyeshadow primer and not a concealer to set your eyes before starting your eyeshadow. So today, this is like the only eyeshadow primer that I have. This is from Essence and it's their eyeshadow base. I actually really, really like this. And that's like the most affordable thing that I have out of all the different eye bases that I did use. I used a couple concealers, the Jouer concealer, the Too Faced concealer. I didn't have any issue blending out my eyeshadow with either of these. I also used the ColourPop concealer and I did have some patchiness with this, but I think it might have just been like how I was doing my makeup and not so much the concealer. So I'm gonna rule this one out for now. But these were definitely great with the palette, no blending issues whatsoever. And then in his video, he did recommend the MAC Paint Pot to prime your eyeshadow. I don't own that anymore. I've ran out of it. I haven't purchased it in a really long time, but this is super similar. This is the NARS Cream Concealer, the Soft Matte Cream Concealer. It's actually not amazingly similar because it's more of like a creamy base compared to the MAC Paint Pot, but it's still a lot more tacky and a lot more mattifying than like a regular liquid concealer. So I did use this just to like apply onto my eye to really pack on color, and I found that this worked really nicely too. So those are all the different things that I've tried with this palette so far just to put the different eye bases to the test. But for today, I did use this actual eyeshadow base from Essence just to like follow his direction of using an eyeshadow base, I used the one that I own. So I'm actually going to be recreating a eye look that I did on Instagram like 6 months ago with like the purples and the greens and some of the pink shades in the Jaclyn Hill palette. Basically like half of the colorful shades in here. There's some similar shades in here, not identical, but we're gonna try to make it look identical, and that way you guys can see how everything blends out compared to each other. I do have a lot of the similar brushes, so I'm gonna start off with a Sigma E40 on each side. So I'm gonna start with the Jaclyn side. Hopefully I don't like go crazy trying to go back and forth, but I'm just gonna start off with, I think this is my usual go-to start off shade from the Jaclyn Hill palette, just like a lightish brown shade. And what Jaclyn's palette does have is way more brown, just in general, but way more like matte transition shades. And then from this palette, we're gonna go in with the one light brown in here. This is a cool tone shadow. I'm gonna just pick up a little bit more. And this isn't gonna look the same when I start out, but I think the next color I layer on can make it a lot more similar. Next up, I'm just gonna use that same brush for my Jaclyn palette. We're gonna go in with this kind of reddish brown. It's kind of light, and just layer that on top just to make it a little bit more of a reddish tone. And then in James' palette, we're gonna use this one. It's kind of like a maroon matte shadow, and just layer that on top of that cool tone brown, and now matches the other side. So next up, I also have two of the same brushes from Persona Cosmetics. I'm going in with a reddish tone. So we're gonna use this one from Jaclyn's palette. This is gonna go in at my outer corner, and I'm gonna carry this up in my crease. And then I'm going in with this shade from James's palette, just doing the same thing on the other side. So far I definitely gotta clean up some fallout on both sides. What I can say is James is right about packing on the color versus blending with some of the mattes. Like, I feel like I'm just pressing this on to get that same color payoff. And I did find that with some of the other shades, if you apply it down right away and just start blending before really packing on the color, you're just gonna blend it away. So you do need to pack more than blend. So I have a Morphe M124 for each side, and I really do wet my brushes a lot to get pigmentation, color payoff, and I'm gonna go in with the second shade in Jaclyn's palette. This is gonna be my lid color. I think that the biggest differences with both palettes is really the pigmentation of the shimmers. This one is the shade that I'm gonna use on my lid. This one's slightly more white, but I'm pretty sure it's gonna look, yeah, looks slightly more white, but you really have to be like looking for it. I'm using this purple shade, and this is like a shimmery purple. It's kind of chunky, so it's kind of hard to work with on its own. I do need to pack on this shade. So I'm actually gonna go in with a denser brush. This is a Morphe E17, and purples can be tricky. And I don't know why, but that's why I don't wear them too often, but I thought that this would be a good way to put it to the test. And this is definitely more of like a true like Barney purple compared to this. This has a little blue in it. So I think I'm actually gonna go in with, let's add a little bit of this to start out, and then I'm gonna pack on this blue, and then to get that shimmer effect, maybe press on some of this pressed pigment. So let's see how this all works out. I'm gonna start off with that same small tapered brush. I have a second one. I have a second of like all of my favorite brushes. So I'm gonna go in with this blue shade just a tiny bit, just to start off that, yeah, that purpley blue base. All right, so now I'm gonna go in with the purple. I'm gonna take a smoky shadow brush from Smashbox. I'm going in with this purple shade. And this is a pressed pigment. This is one of the more difficult shades in, there we go, in the palette. All right, I tried to add the littlest bit of the pressed pigment, this purple shade, on top of the other purple pressed pigment, and I didn't want to mess with it too much. I felt like I was just taking off the eyeshadow, so I'm gonna leave it as is because I don't think this one looks like too shimmery that it makes like such a huge difference. And then I think once I add the lower lash line color, it's gonna look a lot cleaner, but there's still a couple more colors that I want to add. All right, so next up, I'm taking 2 pencil brushes. I'm going to wet them as well. And then I'm gonna use the green shadow in each palette, the bright green, for my inner corner. So I'm gonna take this shadow, and these are slightly different. This one's like a lot more green in the Jaclyn palette, and then in the James palette, it's a little bit more blue. And then the closest shade is this light blue shade. They each have like a slightly different hue, but pretty similar vibes. I think you have to be pretty close up, like the same as you are seeing me now versus like way farther away to like see the difference between both. All right, so I just threw on some mascara on my top lashes and some purple eyeliner. I'm using this one in the shade Vice from Urban Decay. It's almost all the way used up. Purple eyeliner, my lower lash line. And then I'm gonna go in with, let's just do a regular kind of brownish shade to start off my lower lash line. So I'm just gonna mix together the first 2 transition shades, this light brown and then this kind of mauve shade, just to get that same reddish brown look. And then I'm just finishing off the lower lash line with a tiny bit of purple in my outer corner. Just using that matte pressed pigment on the other side. All right, so lastly, I'm just gonna finish up with a brow bone highlight, and I'm just gonna go in with the lightest shade in Jaclyn's palette. I'm gonna use this on my brow bone and then also in my inner corner. And then in here, I'm just gonna use the same shadow that I used for my lid as my brow bone and inner corner highlight. All right, so that's basically the overall feel in the application of both palettes, both formulas. I'm gonna go ahead and put on some lashes and then I'll give you guys all my final thoughts. All right, so here is the completed look with each palette. The Jaclyn Hill palette is on this side. James Charles palette is on this side. They look super, super similar except for like the purple on each eye. And honestly, like the purple can be a little cleaner on each eye. So both purples are a little bit tricky. Definitely the James Charles one is a bit trickier just because it's that pressed pigment and just packing on the shadows. Sometimes, like if you just move your brush the wrong way, it's gonna turn into a mess. So I found that out the hard way a couple times trying out that specific shadow and a couple other the pressed pigments in this palette. So definitely for sure the Jaclyn Hill palette is way more beginner friendly compared to the James Charles palette. Just all the mattes are like the same formula, almost all of the shimmers are the same formula, so you can use them all pretty much the same way to blend out the different shadows. There's not any like disclaimers with the Jaclyn Hill palette about using an eyeshadow primer because it doesn't have those pressed pigments in it compared to the James Charles palette. And then you guys also saw there's so many overlapping shades between both palettes. If they're not identical, they're almost identical. When you apply them on your eye, you're gonna basically get the same look. Like if I did a brown smoky eye on each eye with each of these palettes, they're gonna look completely the same. So if you love neutrals, just stick with this palette because you have all those same neutrals in this palette. And I just see myself sticking to the Jaclyn Hill Morphe palette for those like everyday neutral eye looks compared to the James Charles palette. Like I said, you don't really have a lot of transition shades in here that are neutral. You just have this like cool tone brown and then you get into like those orangey shades. So this is definitely more of like a rainbow, colorful pop of color palette compared to the Jaclyn Hill palette. Definitely like the color schemes in here are very different, but I did want to give you guys some shade comparisons and formula comparisons in case you guys are curious, because I know for me with Morphe, and I think I've said this before, like I'm really interested in the influencer collabs more so than just like any other palette that they come out with. Like I bought this palette specifically to support Jaclyn. I bought this palette specifically to support James, and I was definitely curious about how like the formulas compare compared to each other and if there was any overlapping shades. So overall, if you love neutrals and you just want a couple pops of colors, I think that you would definitely prefer this palette. If you already have this palette, and that's usually how you wear your makeup, and that's how I normally wear my makeup too. I wear a lot of neutral looks, and then I do some blue shadows every now and then. So this is gonna be the palette that you're gonna reach for the most day to day and like long term. But if you're missing like those rainbow shades in your collection, or you do love to play with color and you like the shades that are colorful in here, but you're like, okay, I want some more, then definitely go for this palette if you do want those like rainbow colors specifically. I think if you are somebody who just wants a couple pops of color in your collection, but you're really gonna stick to the neutrals, you're probably not gonna reach for this palette as often because it is more of that like creative, colorful palette for sure. And that's why I did buy this palette as well, because I don't have a lot of like blues and purples and greens in my collection and red in my collection compared to like browns and other shades of brown that I have in like every other palette. So definitely this one's more everyday, beginner friendly. This one's definitely more colorful, rainbow palette. That's what I knew getting into it, but also with the formula differences, I do just find overall this formula I like a bit better. I do find that this is like an elevated formula from Morphe. With this palette, I find it to be very similar to my 35O palette, where the shimmers are pigmented, the mattes blend out, but there's not any extra like creaminess or pop to the shimmers or the mattes in here. So I do find that this quality is just overall a bit like, feels more high-end compared to this one, but I think you're still getting a really, really great value with this palette, especially for all of the colorful shades. Really what makes me like the formula of the Jaclyn Hill palette a little bit more than the James Charles palette is just the shimmer shadows are not as like saturated and creamy and pigmented in James's palette. They are still pigmented. You can build them up really, really nicely, but I feel like in the Jaclyn Hill palette, I'll just show you guys like a couple quick swatches. I just washed my arm for like the 17th time today. So here are just some quick swatches of some of my favorite shimmer shades in the Jaclyn Hill palette. And I feel like swatching it and then also applying it on my eye, like these colors always end up looking this pigmented and this like shimmery and bold on my eye. Like they look very wet when you swatch them, and then when you apply them as well, you don't have to build them up. And then here are some similar shades in James's palette, and they apply nicely, but you can see even like, especially this center shade just looks like a really, really foiled shade, and this is more of just like a shimmer. And these shadows just have a bit more fallout to them. They're slightly chunkier compared to the shimmers in the Jaclyn Hill palette. So I just find that kind of consistent overall between both palettes. They look really similar, but when you go to pack on these shadows from the Jaclyn Hill palette on your eye compared to the James Charles palette, like you don't have to work as much. They go on really foiled, really vibrant. These, I feel like I have to wet my brush a little bit more and pick up more product when I'm going in with these shimmers compared to the Jaclyn Hill palette shimmers. All right guys, so that's gonna be everything for this comparison of both palettes. Are obviously very different color schemes, but I was actually really surprised with how many similarities there was between the shades in both palettes. The formulas are pretty different, and I was really curious about that when I got James's palette, or just when I was seeing the release of it. I wanted to see how it would compare to the Jaclyn Hill Morphe palette, since that is another super popular collab from Morphe. I wanted to see if the formulas were the same or different at all. So I hope if you guys had that same question as I did, that this helped you out. Let me know your thoughts in the comments down below. I will link both palettes in my description box as well, and I will also have an Instagram tutorial going up probably right after this video using James's palette, using all the purple shades in the palette, so you guys can see a tutorial with that. And if you guys like this video, make sure you give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. And I'll talk to you guys soon in my next video. Thank you so much for watching. Bye.